Millennia is Paradox's grand strategy civilization game, and I've played it. So in this video, I get to share everything I know with you. We're going to take a look at this trailer that was just released, and some gameplay and screenshots, and I'm just going to talk you through what this game is, because it's something a bit different and a bit special, I think. You'll notice the first thing that the trailer shows off are different ages. Some of them grounded in history, others like Utopia maybe not so much. As you move through the technology tree, you'll get to move into different ages, I believe around 10 in total. You could go through fairly standard, right? Bronze, iron, etc. Or, depending on how you play, the events of the world, and conditions that may or may not be met, you can also enter these alternative, slightly different ages of conquest, discovery, blood, plague. The list seems to go on and on. I don't know how many there are. Now we'll move through and take a look at the different screenshots, as I mentioned in the introduction, and I'll just say a little bit about what I can see. I'd also like to put out a call to you. If you have specific questions, whether it be about scouts, the buildings, ages, whatever you can think of, how it compares to other strategy games, let me know, write them below, and in about 24 hours time, I'll release another video answering your most popular questions. I'm not quite sure what I'll put in the background. I guess it'll just be these screenshots again, because I'm not allowed to show you any footage from the pretty early access version that I've been playing. And of course, for more like this, please do consider subscribing to the channel and liking and all the good stuff. Now, I'm going to start with this screenshot number 6, because I think it's the best one for setting the scene. You can see a city in the middle of the map, Bordeaux. It's growing, it has some needs. You can see there's a little town next to it. You can build these towns outside of cities, as well as, of course, improving tiles. We'll talk about that later. You got your mini-map down the bottom right, some quick sort of menus that you can jump to control your armies, your cities, and your income in the top right. But the most interesting part is probably over on the left, right? The top left of the screen. They're in the Age of Stone, the first one. It's turn 5, the year is 9000 BCE. They have a research and a culture that they're working through to unlock. Research is the tech tree. Culture is a bit different than what you might think. And there's a specific screenshot about it later, so we'll talk about it then. And finally, domains. At the moment, they just have a government domain, and they've selected a tribal government. This is really just the tip of the iceberg for this domains mechanic though. Taking a look at screenshot 1, you might be a little bit overwhelmed at first. The key parts, we'll talk about the cities and the tiles and all of that in a later screenshot. The key part that I'd like to focus back in on is over on the left-hand side again, at the domains. We can see that this is still a tribal government, so they haven't had a peaceful or violent revolution to change it. And you can do that, by the way, through your culture. Once that bar fills up, you get a bunch of powers you can use, like creating a settler, changing a government through revolution, and many others. But back to the domains, you can see here, there's exploration, warfare, engineering, diplomacy, and the arts. The way that these are unlocked are progressively as you move through the game, and it depends on the decisions that you make, say, within your culture, your research, and your domains. As you start to pick them up, first maybe with exploration, then with warfare, you'll notice that they have a number to their right. So exploration, 419, warfare, 694. This is a currency, effectively, for each one of these domains. Buildings that you construct inside of your city will add to this currency. So warfare, for example, if you construct something like a training camp or a guards camp, that city will earn +1 warfare experience or currency, however we want to describe it. And then, just like with the government, each one of these domains has a wide variety of options. To go back to the warfare one, as a quick example, it has an option that lets you spend about 10 or 15 points on the first go to heal an army outside of friendly territory. Another more expensive option at the moment lets you summon an extra unit into your city, or create an extra unit, I should say. Summon might be a bit Age of Wondersy. But I hope that you get the idea here, that these domains are fed into by cities, and as the cities and maybe other things feed in a currency, you can spend it on abilities specific to that domain. It's a really neat system, actually. So what are the things underneath them though? God King Dynasty, Spice Merchants. Remembering, of course, that all of these categories, including culture, by the way, are fed into by our actions and our cities. The buildings that we make might have +1 engineering, +2 diplomacy. Well, the drop-down parts are even more interesting. They're called national spirits, and you unlock one at the moment, Every second age, you'll do it 4 times, 2, 4, 6, and 8. Inside of it, they vary quite a lot. You can see in Age 2, in this screenshot, it's focused around some of those earlier domains: exploration, warfare, engineering, and diplomacy. The things that come first in human history before you get to some more advanced stuff. Each one contributes some points, and then once you delve into it, you really get a way to sort of shape your nation. If you choose Spartans, for example, which is the example we'll look at in a minute, you'll get a whole load of options that you can spend your warfare experience on to get unique abilities, units, so on and so forth. And all of these share that effect. So there's a real, I think, potential element for a lot of replayability inside of these different spirits. And by the way, it's first in, first served, at least for the best goodies. Now, let's take a look specifically at that Spartan example, which is one that I happened to have played with, so I can speak to it quite a lot. Spartans, a choice very early on, feeds into warfare, and you can see there's kind of like a policy tree here. Different benefits are on offer. Spawn 2 Spartans in your territory. Give them extra defense. Right the way up through to them costing nothing and ultimately feeding into the broader social fabric of your society, a kind of overarching system even above this one. I've also found that it creates an interesting gameplay dynamic where you're weighing up whether you want to spend, say, your warfare points on these abilities, or if you want to use them on those things that I was talking about earlier, like healing an army outside of your territory or spawning in an extra warrior, berserker, I think they're called. So there's a real balancing act to be had on how you develop the civilization. Now, this next screenshot introduces quite a lot: the tech tree and how we advance through ages. We'll start with the tech tree, and you can see that we're looking at here research for the Age of Bronze, second, of course, after the Age of Stone initially. Inside of it, you've got things like belief, community, discipline, officials, mining, and shipbuilding. And inside of each of these techs, there's maybe between 2 and 4 or 2 and 5 different things that you can unlock. Sometimes it's buildings for your cities. It could be units if they're military techs, like shipbuilding, for example, kind of obvious, or it could be technologies related to your civics and the other factors of the game, like religion or tile improvements. You know, the list goes on, and I'm sure if you've played a grand strategy, or more specifically a 4X game, then you'll kind of get a feel for this. Now, once you've researched 3 out of the usually kind of 6 or 7-ish available technologies, then you're allowed to move through to the next age. And this, of course, is where we start to bring in one of the key elements that I think will set this part of the game from all the rest. Obviously, you saw it, it's a big part of the trailer, and it's a huge focus of the game, at least in my experience. In this case, they are presented with 3 options as they move through to the 3rd age in the game. The first one on the list, Age of Blood, and the second, Age of Heroes, have specific requirements about how you play. The third one, in this case Age of Iron, just has that tech requirement. So if you don't want to go into a more specific one, or if you don't meet the conditions to do it, then you'll move through into what we might call a more generic age, in line with human history. Putting that one aside, the 2 spicier ones at the top have further requirements. Not only do you need the standard 3 technologies, but in the case of Age of Blood, which I have played, you need to build up these chaos points by basically doing bad things. Maybe burning down enemy towns, slaughtering their units, and of course you also need to have at least 6 other nations' units, so enemy units, destroyed in battle. So there's a minimum requirement to do a little bit of fighting, and you need to kind of be bad. Age of Heroes, completely different. You need to discover 3 landmarks, these kind of natural wonders, but not necessarily at the grandest of levels. Specific natural features, though, that you should discover, using your scouts, by the way, because discovery doesn't necessarily just mean laying eyes on it, but also interacting. Moving through, one thing you'll do throughout all of the ages, of course, is build cities, and this screenshot gives us the best look zoomed out a bit from the map. You can see cities, you can see tiles that have been improved, and some other sort of smaller regions and oddities that sit between them. We'll talk a little bit more about tile improvements, buildings in a moment, but to focus in on this little bit in particular, because it's kind of interesting. This is, I think they call it an outpost. It sits in between what looks to me like 2 different cities. The cities seem to have some units standing in the city centers as well, little green bars, but in between them is this outpost. Now this outpost relates back to what we were talking about earlier. You get a unit who walks along and places it down through the exploration tree, spending something like 30 or 40 exploration points to unlock it. And that is why this game sort of operates on a few different levels, because you have these points that allow you to build, create, and train units outside of what you're actually doing in the specific city itself. These different powers depending on your domains. Now, this domain is fairly grand, looks like 3 cities and some other thing going on in the right. Let's zoom in a little bit and talk about what these tile improvements actually are. And to understand how they work, we have to go back to this screenshot briefly. Zoom in down the bottom and zoom in again, and you'll see that you have 125 shovel points at the moment, earning 11 per turn. Now, these points are called worker points, and they're generated really in the same way, in principle, that the other sort of domains are generated, those warfare, exploration, etc. Generated maybe within your city, for example. You then spend those points on the world map to upgrade these tiles. Here you can see 3 farms, for example, sitting around a river. Here you'll notice in the middle there's a farm, but it looks slightly different. In fact, this whole civilization looks more developed. You don't just build the improvement once, but you can continue to improve it as you move through the ages. And I've found, in comparison to similar games, there's a lot more improvements, or at least it feels like it up front, because you can just see all of them on this big city UI list, or click into an individual tile and select an improvement appropriate for it. Overall, I think that it actually is really good. Not having to micromanage little worker units around is great, and the points system is pretty satisfying to move through, upgrade your cities. And of course, inside of the city itself, and here's a look at the Build tab, you'll notice in the top left there's also a Workers tab. That's where you can choose where you want your population to be working, which tiles, and Towns, a tab to interact with those extra towns you can build to expand out within a city's borders. But crucially, of course, in the middle here, you get a feel for how building works. You select a card based on the cards that you've unlocked through your technology. You can build either a military unit or a building, and upgrades to buildings are shown here as well. The general cost of buildings and pacing of the game, I've found, at least at this very early access stage, again, remember, is actually kind of challenging almost. You really do have to think about what points do I want to earn, what city do I want to build, and what society do I want to build. And up the top, probably hopefully bringing all of it together, you can see the city income and the domain income, and these icons match up perfectly with the domains we were talking about earlier, the compass for exploration, the swords for warfare. To its left, the income, you can see knowledge +5, money +9, food with the bread +17. Next to it is the worker points with the hammer, and so on and so forth. All of this stuff comes together to, I think, produce a pretty interesting city simulation. As your city grows, its population, you'll also need to meet certain needs like food in the beginning, and then you'll move through to other things like sanitation, for example, where again, you'll have to revisit your city, your tile improvements, and build something maybe like a mass grave. Tile improvement that lifts overall sanitation to meet that need of a growing city. Another thing you might be building, of course, are units, and this one, well, actually we don't see a lot of them. If I zoom in a little bit here, you might be able to see them, but honestly, you might not. Look for those green bars. Zooming in one more time, you can probably start to make out that there are 2 formations inside of the city. Here, if I just isolate one to make it really obvious, is what the military units currently look like in this early access build. They are small. They are hard to see. Combat itself, by the way, is somewhat hands-off. Really, it's about how you design and upgrade your units. You'll then just sort of march them in armies into other armies. And I don't know how to describe it, and there's no screenshot, but you get this little preview, a little 2D preview. The units sort of walk left and right, bashing into each other, and numbers come up reflecting their damage. And that is how a fight is played out. You know, I hesitated even showing this, and I'm just adding it in after the fact, but this is my, obviously very high quality artist's mock-up of what the battle preview sort of looks like. Your units, their units, pops up on your screen, and they take turns sort of moving back and forward and swiping at each other, removing some of their blue, which I think might be some kind of morale, but I'll have to look into that a little bit closer, and their red health bar, something along those lines. They take turns going back and forth for a certain number of rounds, and then the battle is concluded. I hope you enjoyed my top quality paint art. There are, of course, a big number of military units, and there seems to be a huge amount of variety and customization through those domains. And I think probably this is an area that they're still working on, at least around the UI, so that it's a bit easier to actually make out where these units are. because often I find that I might sort of lose them or misplace them and I can't get to them again. I suspect, alongside UI improvements, that this area will continue to develop, and some of the prompts are helpful as well, by the way, like, next unit or unit needs to move, that kind of thing already exists. And in this, the final screenshot, we see an example of an event. This one around a temple, a massive temple, pyramid lays before you. Its content and purpose unknown, and you're left with two options: to send an expedition to explore it, or to enter the temple and take whatever you want. And of course, these options will have different outcomes. The game presents not just events based around what here I'm assuming is around a landmark. It's not just those big natural wonders, but also, as I mentioned earlier, slightly smaller, niche, more nuanced things like a temple, for example. There are also age-specific ones that relate exactly to how you're playing. They present you often with a choice. You either get a good or negative effect, depending on the event and circumstances, or you could choose to take a cash prize or cost instead. So you don't always have to partake in them. This one, though, seems kind of straightforward. There's probably a riskier one with a higher reward, and a simpler option, the first one, with a safer reward. Seeing all of this does, of course, prompt some questions. Speaking of prompt, Prompt Games, by the way, is the independent game developer behind this. It's of course also being published by Paradox, known well for their grand strategy. And if you take a look at their About page, as we did in the last video, so I'll keep this brief, you'll note that they are a relatively small, it seems, independent studio with a lot of experience in games with ages. Age of Mythology, Age of Empires 2, and some other stuff, Orcs Must Die, StarCraft, etc. So hopefully, and from what we've seen so far, we'll be in good hands here, at least with some familiar strategy experience. And whew, I don't know about you, but I kind of need a break after all of that. A lot of information. I hope that you enjoyed it. Of course, we'll play out the trailer one last time in the conclusion here of the video. You can get a glimpse maybe of some units, some buildings, some things that you might understand a little bit better now, I hope. And as I mentioned at the start with that obnoxious call to action, please do leave your questions below. There's probably a lot of questions about this. I hope to have answered many of them in this video. Again, one final reminder, in a very early access state. Thanks so much for hanging out and unpacking this with me. I can't wait to share more insights with you. I'll see you next time.